Have you ever thought about the cheese you're eating, whether it's part of your food, such as pizza, or an artisan cheese served as an appetizer? Did you know that in 2024, U.S. cheese production totaled a record 14.25 billion pounds, and that there were 509 plants in the U.S. producing cheese? Or that the industry employs almost 62,000 people? Welcome to Brungart Law's Lanyap, where we provide you a little extra perspective beyond the law through conversations with individuals from all walks of life. I'm Maurice Brungart, your host. I enjoy engaging with experienced, knowledgeable, and passionate individuals for the opportunity it affords to broaden and deepen understanding of the world through their perspectives. They offer insights into what makes for effective practices and policies, enabling productive decision making in our own lives. The more we learn, the more likely we can avoid common pitfalls, become better versions of ourselves, and guide others towards the same. Today's guest that we'll be learning from is Miss Marianne Smukowski, a dairy industry specialist. She was former president of the American Cheese Society, previously dairy safety and quality coordinator for many years at the Center for Dairy Research at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and also she was the recipient of the American Cheese Society's 2020 Lifetime Achievement Award. Welcome to the program, Ms. Smukowski.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Go ahead and share with our listeners your background.
Well, my background started going to the University of Wisconsin here in Madison, and my first major was chemical engineering. And I'm like, I started taking some of the classes and I don't want to do stats. So I switched over to agriculture chemistry or agriculture engineering, and I'm like, nah, that ain't gonna cut it either. So I switched to food science, and I found my passion with food science. So I did that and graduated in it with a food science degree. And then I had the opportunity to work for the USDA Dairy Division for a number of years, and I was worked on the line. I did a lot of inspections, and I ultimately became a supervisor for the region. After that, I was approached, said, "Hey, would you want to consider working for Land O'Lakes?" Because I knew one of the people working there who did all the audits. And he's like, "Hey, I think you'd be a good fit for Land O'Lakes to do all our corporate audits." So I looked into it and did the interview and received the position. And that covered doing all the audits and inspections, whatever you want to call it, for all their cheese and butter operations. So I did that. And then I was like, spent a lot of time on the road. I need to get off. That for 5 years. And then I saw this opportunity here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison at the Center for Dairy Research for a HACCP coordinator. And I'm like, oh, it's an opening for 3 years. So see what happens. So after that project got completed, I was approached by my director at that time, which was Dr. Rusty Bishop, and he said, "Marianne, based on your background, I think we could create an applications program area on food safety. I think you'd be good at it. I'm going to let you run with it, so you're ultimately responsible. So if it fails, it's on you, but if you do it, it could be a really cool thing for the industry of Wisconsin." So I was fortunate enough to come along at the right time to create this position, and I ended up doing it for 25 years.
That's phenomenal. Harking back to your college days in food science, at the time you were pursuing that, had that field of study already been around a while, or was that a sort of new field that they were offering at the university?
No, it's been around for quite some time. I mean, the building itself, Babcock Hall, was around since 1951. So they've always had this food science degree, and they had three different areas you could do it. And I took the area of food chemistry, but there was other options you could have for natural science and things like that. So that's been around for quite some time. We were one of the first dairy schools to teach dairy schools because it's Wisconsin and we had this opportunity. So it's been around for a long, long time. You have dairy science and now you have food science. So I'm like, I could take a lot of food science courses. I could eat ice cream while I'm taking the class. So it was kind of cool to be in that building and to understand what it all meant to this day what it meant with Babcock Hall. So it was pretty cool to get a degree from University of Wisconsin Madison, and it was
Okay.
in my home state, so that made it even better.
Well, do you have any awareness if the program has changed dramatically, or are many of the principles the same? I mean, are they doing things completely different in the academic field there as they're preparing others much like yourself?
Well, they still have the food science program here, and you can graduate in it. They tweaked it along the way because some of the professors have retired and they've addressed what the needs are of the industry. So they tweaked it along the way and they made other things available so you could go out there and pursue a food science degree. So it could be in research and development, it could be in quality control, it could be in, do you want to be a plant manager, or production supervisor, things like that. So they kind of tweaked it based on what the needs were of the industry.
Okay. And tell us a little bit about your time when you were working as a liaison with the FDA. What was that relationship like, and what were the responsibilities involved?
Well, during that time, there was a lot of things going on, and we wanted to make sure our voice was being heard from Wisconsin because Wisconsin is one of the leading dairy states, and we were making sure we were being I hate this term, but I'm going to use it anyways, proactive in making sure we were included in a discussion and to make sure our thoughts were known and that it wasn't going to be a hindrance to the industry, but it would be very helpful. And we wanted to make sure we were part of that so we could be part of the process to remedy any situations that came up. And it wasn't just with the FDA, it was with the state agriculture department too. So we wanted to make sure our voice was heard and to make sure we worked as a team, not as an adversarial relationship.
And back then, what was the industry like compared to what it is today?
Well, back then, things were, you made a particular product and you did your work, and people would come in and do the inspections and audits, and they were like, oh, what can we find to ding you or get you on? And we didn't want that. We wanted to have a very good working relationship, and there was something wrong that was occurring, and it was very common in a number of different plants. We wanted to make sure we addressed that to make sure there wasn't anything that was hindering the industry as a whole, and that's what we were trying to do.
And what were some of the initial obstacles that you found, especially this being a new position that you had occupied?
Well, I think part of the problem was, they had their role they had to do. It's always, I'm the government and I'm here to help you type thing. We, that was the saying back then. And it's like, well, we want to be part of the solution, not the problem. So there's things that, let's work together. And if there's a regulation that's not working, or if there's something that's not working, and then the whole industry got together and ensured that with the regulatory folks, then we could work with them and make sure we got things changed, and which was a compromise between the two of them.
Back then, who were some of the leading cheese producers?
Well, they're still the same folks that we have here. You have the big companies here in Wisconsin, but I mean, throughout I already know the ones in Wisconsin. You had Sargento and Schreiber and Land O'Lakes, but back then there was also a boom for getting into artisan or specialty type cheeses. So the industry kind of changed because those smaller plants needed to adapt to stay in business. So they turned and came to the Center for Dairy Research to say, hey, what cheeses can we make that we can still keep in business, stay in business? So that whole specialty cheese artisan thing changed during that time frame.
Okay. And then as time progressed, obviously, your responsibilities started changing. What were the things that you found made your job easier from your perspective? What that was within your span of control? What did you find made you more effective in this line of work?
Well, I think with me being able to go into the plant and help them And if they knew regulatory was coming in soon, I could go in and walk through the plan and point things out to them. Hey, you may want to take a look at this, or hey, you may want to correct this before regulatory comes in. And so I was like their eyes prior to their inspection or audit coming in from the regulatory folks saying, this is what you need to do. Because based on my background, I could go in and say, hey, you need to maybe consider this and do this and help them. And, maybe review their paperwork to make sure it's up to date and current. And it made it much easier for them to work with the regulators, knowing they had a resource to go to in case there was a problem. And I would get phone calls saying, hey, the folks were just in here, they're saying this and this, can you help me out?
And at that time, was there already a artisan cheese sector, or was that still up and coming?
It was up and coming. We had a person who worked at the center who went and visited other countries and say, what cheeses can we bring back to Wisconsin that would help the industry here and make different products besides what I call the commodity type cheeses like cheddar, Mott's, Jack, and things like that. So he went to visit all those facilities over in Europe, and he brought that knowledge back, and then the center helped create make procedures and everything like that, and worked with the smaller guys and saying, hey, maybe you want to think about this cheese, this would help you stay in business, and you can convert it over to another cheese, not the commodity type cheeses, because everybody can make cheddar. I shouldn't say that, but that's why I think everybody can. But if you can make a specialty type cheese, that would be great, and that would help them stay in business. And a lot of the guys, took it to heart, and they converted over to making all these other different specialty cheeses, and they're doing quite well.
Well, speaking of your home state, Wisconsin, it's my understanding that last year it had produced about 3.6 billion pounds of cheese. And what I find sort of ironic is this is almost equivalent to France's production of cheese, which is about 3.8 billion pounds in 2022. And although it doesn't equate France's, it's not far behind. What do you have to comment on that? The fact that the state of Wisconsin is producing almost the same amount of cheese as a major European country.
That's true, but you got to look at the type of cheeses that are being made over in France. A lot of it's raw milk cheeses. It's a specialty cheese. We're still making mozzarella here. We're still making cheddar, but we are doing some of the specialty cheeses here. We're just very passionate about making good, safe product cheeses here.
Okay. Well, speaking of good, safe products, over the years that you've worked, do any particular laws or policies, regulatory policies, come to mind that you have found that have benefited the industry, and those that perhaps have not? They've actually proven to be counterproductive.
I think that's a good question. They're always tweaking the laws and getting involvement from the producers or manufacturers to help with those laws. There's committees that are set up to be a liaison between the regulators and the manufacturers. Yes, some rules and regulations were updated and revised, and it was based on input from industry and what the current needs are. Things have changed quite a bit from the 50s to now with production and manufacturing. So to keep up with the times, you had to change some of the rules and regulations. I mean, back then, what did they do with the whey? They probably let it go down the drain. And now whey is probably, some people think whey is more important than cheese. So, you had to adapt to what the needs were and what was happening in the industry.
If you wouldn't mind, for those in the audience that might be unfamiliar with the term whey, if you could elaborate on that.
Well, it's the old saying, curds and whey, it's the liquid portion that's made when you make cheese. So when you get the cheese or the cheese curds, what's the leftover liquid is the whey, what's called whey.
And speaking of producers and manufacturers participating in in the process, um, do they now play a substantial role in influencing it? Is it a collaborative process in determining the type of regulatory policies that should be in place? Because at the end of the day, the manufacturers and producers, they're the ones that are discovering through trial and error, and now they actually have an established process based on those lessons learned. But do you find that they now have a bigger voice in trying to set the standards through regulation?
I think in the state of Wisconsin, there's a good working relationship between manufacturers and regulators. I can't say that about every state because I'm not
Okay.
familiar with that. With the current, and I didn't want to get into politics here, but with the current administration, things are changing and folks don't know what's going to be happening in the future here with FDA and everything else. So I think the states may need to take a more active role of what is going to be happening in their state because they may be asked to do more regulatory and more regulations and more inspections and things like that. But I think in Wisconsin, we're always going to be very working together to make sure we're still putting out a very safe and wholesome product because we don't want a black eye on any of the dairy products here in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Because if it's one plant that has a recall, it's going to affect everybody here in the state, regardless. It's like, oh, that cheese came from Wisconsin. No, I don't know if I want to eat that, and because they assume that cheese is all the same and coming from Wisconsin, that would set a really black eye. So it's been very helpful that the industry worked together so they didn't create that not nonsense, but create that stuff that happens when you hear about a recall. And we've been very good about not having many recalls.
Well, speaking of recalls and that affecting like the entire industry, all the various plants and the producers in the state of Wisconsin, should that ever occur, a recall there or trace to a cheese there. Um, if you could sort of provide a description for our listeners what a cheese plant consists of. I mean, the nuts and bolts of it. What goes into this process? And obviously, it's going to be different at the mass production level with the cheddar that you had mentioned and the mozzarella, as opposed to the artisan type cheeses. But again, I think audiences might be interested in hearing. Okay, well, what goes on in a cheese plant? Where does it start? How does it end? What's happening in the middle? How is the cheese made, so to say?
Well, you're going to start from the beginning. If somebody wanted to build a brand new plant, they would have to have some, engineering drawings and things like that, what the flow is and all that. But they would still have to, here in Wisconsin, they have to get the regulatory approval for that particular building and what equipment goes into that. And there's approved equipment that has to be used that's for dairy products only. You can't put in, if you're going to buy used equipment, you don't want something from fruits and vegetables or a meat plant to bring into the plant because you don't know what potential contamination you could have with the used equipment. So here in Wisconsin, you have to, get the plans approved, get the equipment approved, and then they put it all in and then they start it. So when the first thing that's going to happen is milk is going to be delivered to the plant. And they have to unload the milk, but before they can do that, they have to test for antibiotics if there's anything present in the milk. So they will test that, and then they will unload it. They'll put it into a tank or a silo, and then it will be stored for a while, depending on how fast they want to use it and how fast they're going to make it the next day or that day for making their cheese. So then the milk will be pumped over, it'll be pasteurized if you're making pasteurized cheese, and then it'd be pasteurized, and then it'd go into the make area where they're making cheese. They'll go through all these different equipments, and depending on what cheeses you're making, you might have different pieces of equipment for that. And then they make it, they package it, and then they store it and refrigerate it, and then depending on what cheese they're making, they'll ship it out and then go out to the distributor and then go out into the store. That's a very simplified version of that, but that's kind of what happens at those plants.
Yes.
for that.
Earlier, you had stated uh, the need to have specific type equipment for dairy products only. Is this equipment that's manufactured in the United States, or is this equipment that needs to be purchased from overseas?
A lot of the equipment is made here in the States, but you still need to make sure it's designed for particularly dairy products. There is some equipment that's made over, like it's say in Europe, but then you still have to get approval for that equipment to come over here in the States and be used here in the state. And especially in Wisconsin, it has to meet those regulations of what that equipment is needed for that particular product.
And that
So there
approval
is
is
some,
that approval is happening at the state level.
yeah, so most people, when they're in a plant and they're buying equipment, they'll put it right on the bill of lading, must meet the requirements of 3A or must meet the requirements for USDA or, the state of Wisconsin or whatever. They'll put that right on the bill of lading and say, you have to meet these requirements, otherwise we're not gonna buy that piece of equipment.
Okay. And obviously, cheese is a dairy product, so cows are the source of and goats as well. But I'm kind of curious: is the production of cheese seasonal a seasonal product, or can it be made year round?
Depending what type of cheese it is. I mean, if you're using sheep or goat, that could be seasonal,
Okay.
unless they freeze it, store it, and bring it back out to use. But if you're using cow's milk, you can make that year round.
Okay. And storage. So I take it there's substantial resources dedicated to refrigeration, correct?
Correct.
And cost in terms of electricity must be a huge factor for running one of these plants.
Exactly. I don't know those exact numbers, but there's some costs involved for that, for refrigeration, for storage, and all that. But there are requirements that you have to have for storing that milk prior to making any dairy product. There is refrigeration requirements in storage that you must meet those also. So, when an inspector comes in, they're going to check, is that milk stored below 45 degrees, for example. Are they going to go into the cooler and say, hey, what's the temperature of this particular product? And they're going to check your records and they're going to see if you have a recording device that's recording, or somehow, if it's a smaller plant, you may check the thermometer, and are they documenting those results every day, what that temperature was from that time. It could be on an alarm system also, that if you get above a certain temperature, an alarm will go off and notify you, hey, there's something going on in the cooler, we need to fix it.
All right. And these requirements, are they state level requirements, or is there also a federal component to them?
You have state requirements and you have federal.
All right. Huh. Well, if we were to kind of look at now the people element here, generally speaking, how many people are working in these plants? And obviously, it's going to vary according to plant size, but how many folks are involved?
It depends, how big the plant is, and how automated it is.
Does it require a particular skill set, or?
Well, in Wisconsin, you have to be a licensed cheesemaker. You have to take an exam, and you have to pass that to be a licensed cheesemaker. You also have to be a licensed pasteurizer operator to run the pasteurizer. So we have certain, and if you're making butter, you're gonna have to be a licensed butter maker.
A licensed butter maker, okay.
Yes. And so, but those are the requirements in Wisconsin. We're the only ones that really require that. Other states haven't adapted that you have to be a licensed cheesemaker or butter maker, but that's what we've done here, and that's been going on for almost 100 years. That you have to be a licensed operator to do that. So there are some requirements. You also have a quality controller person involved that will, monitor, a host of different things that they'll have in there. And then you have the guys who are folks who run the line who are making the cheese. And then you have the receiving and shipping folks, and then you have the office staff that keep all the records, for storage and receiving and everything else that's being shipped out. So there's a host of different people. I've worked in some plants, the artisans, there may be 5 to 10. I've been in big plants that may have 400 people in it, depending how big the operation is. So it varies depending on what you're making and the size of your plant. I have one person who, made an artisan cheese and they only made 1,000 pounds a year. So it varies. And then there's other people who received over 1 million pounds of milk in a day. So they're making a lot of cheese.
Yes, I can imagine with the 1 million pounds. To an outsider hearing, wow, a licensed cheesemaker, a licensed pasteurizer operator, a licensed butter maker, and the idea, oh man, do they have like a license with their picture on it, sit in their wallet to prove? No, and I know it's not like that, but what I'm getting to at this point is, to an outsider, how would you respond to perhaps the observation that there's too much regulation? Would you say that in this case, and you mentioned these regulations and standards have been around for 100 years, this is an example of regulations that do work? This is not an over-regulated industry. It's a reflection of the tried and true practices of the manufacturers and producers?
Well, we also have licensed cheese graders and licensed butter graders.
So there's more licenses.
There is more, but anyways, I didn't want to forget that. There was a situation, back in the 20s where there was inferior product and stuff was being put in there, and he wanted to make sure that they had a very safe and wholesome product. So Wisconsin came up with, well, we're going to license folks to make sure, one, they know what they have to do, how to do it, and they're going to make sure they follow all those requirements. Yeah, when you're a licensed grader, you get a little stamp with your number on it to indicate that's you grading the cheese or butter. But I've never heard anybody complain that to become a licensed cheesemaker here in Wisconsin. To them, it's it's a pretty cool thing. Hey, I'm a licensed cheesemaker. I get to do this. And they're pretty proud of it, and they want to, maintain that integrity of those cheeses.
For the folks out there, what does it take to be a licensed cheesemaker? I mean, more or less, how long can it take, and what's involved in it? Is it pure academic studies? Is it a mix of academics and apprenticeship?
It's a combination of the both. You have to take some classes. You have to work with a fellow cheesemaker for a number of hours, and then you have to take a written exam. And you have to pass the written exam with, I think the last time I checked was 80% you have to get right for the answers. And it's just,
I heard it's a really long exam, correct?
Yeah, it's a written exam, and it covers a host of different things like manufacturing practices, math about, what you do and how with different things. If you have this acidity and during the cheese making, what do you do to correct it? Things like that. So it's not easy, and it was not meant to be easy. Yeah. But if you pass it, you're like, hey, I'm a cheesemaker. That's a pretty cool thing. And I've never heard anybody in the state complain of the requirements and what was needed, because they thought it was pretty prestigious to become one of those licensed cheesemakers.
Fascinating. And how long does it take, out of curiosity?
Well, depending on what your experience is, it could take, 18 months, 24 months, working with a cheesemaker side by side. First, you have to find somebody who will allow you to apprentice with them. And then you have to take some of the classes, and then you got to take the exam. So, hopefully you're working in a plant that side by side anyways, along a licensed cheesemaker. And, once they feel like you're ready, you may want to take the required course or whatever, and then take the test to see if you can pass.
Demographically, over the years, when you first started out, was the cheese industry, whether it was the cheesemakers or the pasteurizers, was there a predominance of a particular gender or individual? I mean, was it mostly men, mostly women? How has it changed over time? How have you seen the labor force from cheesemaker to butter maker to the operators and whatnot change?
Back, I mean, go 50s, 60s, 70s, they were probably mostly men.
Okay.
Women got into it and started saying, "Hey, I can make cheese, I can make butter, I can do this," and it's still pretty dominant by men, but more and more women are getting involved. They're not just doing the QC jobs anymore; they're doing the cheese making and the butter making. So it's changed over time for that to occur. You know,
And um, speaking of the cheesemakers, the licensed cheesemakers, do you know if the numbers have been increasing over the years? Are we maintaining a steady growth in cheesemakers, or is it simply a stable number over the years?
I don't know the exact numbers because you lose plants throughout the years for whatever reason. So some plants maybe have 5 to 10 cheesemakers on site. One might only have one cheesemaker on site, but I think people are getting invested in this area, thinking, "Oh, I can make cheese. I can do this." So it'd be kind of fun to try it and do it. Um, it may have gone up a little bit with the specialty cheese and artisan and farmstead cheesemakers, for that. But I think it's been pretty steady for that, and maybe even a little increase based on, what the needs are of the industry.
And speaking of the artisan cheesemakers, tell us what you've seen change there over the years. How has that evolved? Because as you stated at the beginning, it was an up and coming thing, and now, on my visits to Madison, I've seen, wow, this is incredible. You know,
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, I think people wanted or had to change from making the commodity cheeses like cheddar jacks, Kobe's, mozzarellas, and the state was fortunate to have a person working at the center who went over to see what different types of cheeses you could bring and make at these places. And the specialty cheese industry just boomed. I just read this week that here in Wisconsin, I can't remember the number, but it just reached the maximum on what it is. So I think more and more people are getting used to trying those other cheeses and want to have them and taste them and say, "Hey, let's try this cheese at a party or whatever," instead of the cheddars and the Kobe's, and all that and Jacks. So they're trying all these different cheeses. Their taste buds are getting used to it, and they're getting adapted to what those other cheeses are, and they want more of those cheeses because they say, "Oh, this is a pretty good piece of cheese. Let's keep eating it."
hmm.
So I think in general, I think it's grown quite a bit, and I like the diversity that we have. It's not all the same types of cheeses that they were back in when my dad was growing up and when I was growing up.
And,
I
and,
mean,
and
he loved brick. My dad loved brick. We'd take road trips to go get specialty style brick cheese because he loved it. So that was our road trip.
and speaking of the diversity there, have you found, is it recently or has it been actually happening for several years now, an influx of new styles of cheeses? Like, for example, your cheeses from Latin America, cotija cheese, and from other places. What observations do you have regarding that?
I think, it's slowly increasing and growing. I think when people get introduced to that cheese, they're like, "Where's this from? Where can I buy this?" where can I find this? And I think it's a new cheese. They want to try it. So I think it's a progressive growth on all those,
Yes.
what's happening. And, you know, you got the Latin styles, you got the Caribbean, you got the, you know, we have the Oostalipa from Denmark, you know. So I think it's like they want to make sure, hey, this is a cool cheese. I want to know about it. I was talking to my neighbor yesterday outside, and she's like, Marianne, what was the name of that cheese? You told me that the cheese is wrapped around in bark. And
Wrap
like,
around bark, you say?
bark,
Like bark of a tree?
bark, yeah. And she's like, what was the name of that? I want to go try it. Where can I find it? And I'm like, okay. So we talked for a while, and she's like, oh, yeah, I need to get some. So, you know, there's interest out there, and people are willing and able to try it. So I think that's a good thing. You know, they're not holding back and saying, it's, you know, it's wrapped around in bark or something. But it's the cheese in the middle that you scoop out and just, you know, eat it. And it's good.
Well, a bit on the lighter side, you've been a judge, right? You've like actually participated in competitions and rated cheeses, right?
Oh, I grade in a number of contests. I do Wisconsin State Fair. I do National Milk. I've done U.S. contests, World contests, American Cheese Society contests. I've done a lot of them. And they know I can grade a number of different cheeses. So I tend to get what I call the funky cheeses, you know, not the very common cheeses, you know, because I think a lot of the judges who judge, they can grade cheddar and Kobe and Jack, but can they judge all the other top type of cheeses that are out there? So, and then I do other dairy products too. I don't just do cheese. I do butter, yogurt, you know, sour cream, whatever it may be, milk. So when I run the state fair contest, I don't do the cheeses. I do all the non-cheese products at the state fair. I'm in charge of that.
And when a cheese is being judged, what's the criteria for a good cheese? I mean, considering there's so many different flavors.
You have a scorecard that you look at, and you're breaking into different categories. Like, you know, you have a mozzarella category, you have a cheddar category, for example, or a pepper jack example. You know, and you're looking at the flavor and body and texture and things like that to determine color. So there's a host of different things that you look at, and it's based on, you know, what your experience is as grading cheeses and how experienced are you to know what those cheeses are. So you're paired up with another judge, and you compare and you judge and you score it out accordingly. So it's harder, or it's not harder, but for a first time judge, it's a little intimidating. But once you start getting into it and knowing it and what the scorecard is and what's required, you know, it's just years of experience on how to judge or grade those cheeses.
And what makes for a good cheesemaker? What have what have you picked up over the years? This cheesemaker, has achieved success because of what?
Well, I think a good cheesemaker will always want to continue to learn and get more and more acclimated to their type of cheese or any new cheese. So if you stop learning, you're not going to know what's out there and what to expect, and say, hey, here's a new thing we're doing with this particular product. Maybe I should learn about it. So you take some courses and you get some education to continue that knowledge for that. And, the center did a lot of courses, a lot of training and education for cheesemakers and other folks to make sure they're always constantly learning and to see what's happening out there and what can I do to make my cheese better. Maybe it's a different starter culture, or maybe it's a different, we don't use different salts, or we add different flavors. What would that happen to it if I add flavors to my cheese? What would happen, and how do I do that, and for things like that. So I think it's a constant learning cycle for those guys. And to me, a good cheesemaker is always going to want to learn more and make themselves better.
How how much of a role does technology play in this? For example, can a good cheesemaker do this without technology? And I'm sure the answer is yes. But then where does technology actually benefit the cheesemaker?
I think with technology, if you didn't have it, you would still be in that same pattern and never growing, never getting any better. So I think technology has helped people maybe learn how to make cheese a little faster, or maybe they have some new equipment that makes it get you a better cheese that you don't have so many body defects or something like that. So technology helps to enhance your product.
Okay. Um, do you see that the cheese industry is going to continue to grow, or is there sufficient room for expansion?
I think the cheese industry is always going to grow. I think there's always going to be some newfangled thing coming out there, and I think, as some of us get older, well, all of us are getting older, but as we get older, your taste buds change, and you want to have more flavor, and you want to have more oomph to that cheese. So you're going to come up with and decide, hey, I need to really taste what that cheese is like. You know, the center is working right now on how to make squeaky curds that
Squeaky
last
curds.
longer.
What is
Yeah,
that?
when you eat cheese curds, is it squeaky on your cheese?
Okay.
Have you had cheese curds?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so when you chew fresh cheese curds, they're a little squeaky on your teeth. You can feel it and hear that
Yeah.
squeakiness. So then after it gets older, the cheese curds get a little older, they tend to lose that squeakiness. So, but people are looking for that.
Huh.
I mean, it's not the deep fried cheese curds or
Yes.
anything like that, it's the fresh curds. But people want to know that, hey, this is a really good cheese curd. Well, we're obsessed here in Wisconsin about cheese curds, but you want that squeakiness. I mean,
Okay.
there's millions of pounds of cheese curds that are made in this state, and other parts of the country now are learning about cheese curds, and I'm like, oh, this is a pretty cool product. I like this. You can just eat them. But they want that squeakiness.
Understood. Understood. What do you see are challenges and obstacles for the cheese industry at this time?
Right now, I think it's going to be what the current status on in federal regulatory, what's going to happen with those folks out there. It's unexpected right now, and you don't know what to expect and hear and do. I think the states are going to really need to continue what they're doing and continue to make sure they're putting out a very safe and wholesome product. But I think as inspectors get older and there's a bunch of new folks coming on board, do they have that knowledge and experience to come into a plant and say, hey, this isn't working, this isn't right, or this is, something like that? So I think there's some concern out there what's going to be happening out in with the federal regulations.
Do you find that regulators, whether they're at the state or federal level, or maybe there's a difference, um, they've improved in terms of their skill and professional education, their development?
That's a hard question, and I don't know I want to touch that one.
Fair enough.
Um,
Fair enough.
um,
I mean, obviously, government tends to lag behind private industry, but in some areas they are able to keep up. They're not lagging far behind, is how I wanted to phrase that. But in other areas, no, they fall way behind.
and it depends. I'm going to go. It depends on what state you're in.
Okay.
I think some states are more willing and able to learn and to train their inspectors to make sure they can go into a plant and assess a situation that may be occurring. Do they know all the current requirements and rules for like equipment coming into the facility, or do they know the regulations of what it should be for antibiotic testing or whatever it may be? So the big thing is how do you get those folks educated and that they can step into a plant and they won't feel like, oh, I mean, over my head, or the industry's not gonna respect me because I don't know what I'm talking about,
Yes.
you know? So I think that part is the education, but we're still in the unknown of what we're gonna hear out of DC area.
Okay. Speaking of relationship between the government and the industry, obviously there's a certain amount of subsidies. Um, if you have any commentary on the role that subsidies play, and so again, the amount of federal dollars that are going to the dairy industry is only 0.1% of the U.S. market value. So some folks would argue, hey, since it plays such a small percentage, they don't even need that. Why should we continue to dole out tax dollars to these folks since it really isn't a major part? But what would be the impact of cutting off those subsidies?
Well, I think cutting off any of the money might affect research, and research plays a real big role in the dairy industry. Maybe there's some new fangled product that we're not aware of, or maybe we can improve upon other products out there. So I think research dollars are being affected right now, and I don't know if that's a good thing that that's happening, to stop research. I'm concerned about, you know, importing and exporting a product. We do a number of things with that too. And it's like, well, how are the tariffs gonna affect that? So just because dairy only got a small percentage doesn't mean we should be left behind or forgotten. We need to still continue all that research and continue to help the industry get better.
In terms of the industry, one question I'd want to ask you is what you see as perhaps one of the greatest threats to the cheese industry. And something that occurred to me and I wanted to ask, so we'll digress briefly, is mad cow disease something that ever played a prejudicial role in the cheese industry? I mean, how far does that extend? Uh,
That hasn't been a big item, mad cow disease in the dairy industry. In certain parts of the world it has, but here it hasn't. But if we lose the testing and the research on it, it could come in to be a factor,
okay.
you
So,
know?
are there other ecological threats to the industry?
Um, you know, what about antibiotic testing? What about, are we gonna look at just one antibiotics or a series of antibiotics, or what are we gonna do for that? What other things are we gonna be looking at? I'm trying to think of a term, but I can't come up with it right now. Um, I'm concerned, and I didn't want to bring this up, was plant-based products.
Okay.
Um, there's a concern in the dairy industry that with plant-based products because it's not made from milk. And I think, I don't know, all consumers are confused by that, or do they understand it? Do they know you can't get milk from a soybean?
Yes.
Or oat,
Yes.
things like that. So I think there's some confusion out there. We've had regulations for over 100 years based on the pasteurized milk ordinance, where milk comes from a hoofed animal.
Yes.
And when you say there's soy milk, it's like, and that's not right. You could call it juice, you could call it liquid or something, but I think there's some confusion out there with that. And that's not true milk.
Understood. Okay. Um, it's my understanding that the Commodity Credit Corporation supports farm income and helps keep the food prices stable with loans, direct payments, surplus crops purchases. Um, I mean, in your line of work over the years, uh, does this play a part in the cheese industry and the dairy industry as well, or a limited role?
It did when I first started, when I was with USDA, we did a lot of those with the CCC. We would make 5 pound and 2 pound loaves of all the cheese that was made into processed cheese, and we'd hand it out. So that made, and they bought a lot of butter back in the day too. Um, they haven't bought a lot of it. They have contracts out there now that they will ask for string cheese or whatever cheese they're out there. They would do that, but it wasn't as big as it was back in the 80s and 90s. So it plays a role. I'm not sure how big a role it plays right now, but it did back in the day.
Okay. In Wisconsin, is the industry more towards the artisan side, or is it more towards the mass production of your mozzarellas and your cheddars?
I think it's a diverse amount of both in the state. You have your big manufacturers and you have a lot of the specialty type cheesemakers here in the state. So we have a good diverse make of all the different cheeses in the state. So yes, you have your big manufacturers and you have your artisans who make specialty cheeses.
And regarding the other states, do you have any observations of others that are sort of Wisconsin's competition, for lack of a better word? Who's Wisconsin's biggest competitor?
Well, it's always been California for that, but depending on what cheeses you're making, it could vary. But California has always been up there. You see newcomers like Idaho making more cheese. You see, the Southwest, there's the South part of it, like Texas, New Mexico, that area, with having more milk production coming along. The Midwest, not so much. You don't see that as growing as much, but states like Idaho, I'm going to say Texas, Arizona, or New Mexico, they're more of the getting all that milk in because of the huge farms they have there, and they're making products there. So, California's always been a competition for us.
and they're still losing.
Well, they make a lot of milk, and their cheese is pretty much equal, but sometimes Wisconsin's a little higher, sometimes California, but that's always been the place.
And speaking of the trade now, does Wisconsin trade a lot of its cheese with Canada?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay. And you yourself, do you have any particular favorite types of cheeses now that you've done this for decades?
I like the Fontinas. I like cheese with a little flavor. I like the aged cheeses. I like the Fontinas. But I'll eat a piece of cheddar. I'll eat, string cheese. I'll eat a variety of different cheeses. But Fontina's always been my favorite. And, I'll try any cheese.
Is there a particular way? Well, I'm sure it depends on the cheese, but the way a cheese should be served and cut.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're going to a neighborhood party, you're going to put cheese on a platter and eat it with some crackers. I'm the one who always brings the cheese to my neighborhood party. They're like, oh, what'd you bring this time? So, oh, tell me about it. My neighbor wants me to do a cheese tasting party for them. But, it's just what it is on a cheese platter.
Yes. Have you had an opportunity to go to Europe and see some operations there and learn, hey, wow, if we could do it that way, or, oh, I'm glad we don't do it that way, sort of observations?
I did a judging contest over in France and judged with them many moons ago. I also did some projects with the USA, but in Lithuania and Latvia, but I have not gone to. Oh, I did go to Greece. I take that back. I did go to Greece to learn some practices on how they make their feta cheeses and things, and their Greek cheeses over there. But that wasn't my role, so I didn't do a lot of that.
Okay. Um, well, as we're nearing the end of our time, are there any last parting thoughts you'd like the audience to know about the cheese industry, whether it's misconceptions, things that just details? Because I always like to say the devil's in the details. Is there any particular observations or anecdotal experiences you'd like to share with the audience regarding your time?
One thing I'd recommend the book Poison Squad.
Poison
by Deb-
Squad?
Poison Squad by Deborah Bloom. It was about the story of Harvey Washington Riley. He worked for the U.S. Was it? Yeah, he was with the USDA, with a chemist there, and this is how the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act came about, because he was finding all the stuff that was in food, and he was the one who started doing all this testing on it to make sure. I mean, you can't have borax in products, stuff like that. So it's an interesting read. It's a quick read. The Poison Squad. For that, it was I some people found it boring, but I worked for USDA, so I knew all that,
Yes.
some of that stuff. But I thought it was a good read to understand the history, why things got created back it did in 1906 and other things. So knowing the history and what happened and what created this and why we still are so vested in it to make sure we're putting out a very safe and wholesome product. So, something like that. To me, it's like, don't be afraid to try any cheeses. You may find one you like. You're like, oh, I never heard of that. This is pretty good. I want to buy some more. So don't be afraid to try new cheeses, or venture away from the typical cheeses like cheddar, Kobe's, and Jack's. Try the flavored cheeses. There's some really good flavored cheeses out there. And it's not just cheeses, Maurice. All the dairy products.
Yes.
Butter, sour cream, yogurt, all that. There's some really good dairy products out there. So I try not to put myself just in a cheese box. I like, no, there's ice cream, there's custard, there's a whole bunch of different dairy products out there that you should try and get used to. Yogurts, there's some really good yogurts out there. Kefir, that's really good too. So, don't limit yourself to one particular dairy product. Do a broad base.
And have you seen anything, again, past, let's say, as recent, past couple of years, some new developments in the cheese industry that's like kind of really grabbed your attention and wondered, ooh, I wonder what would happen, if that continues on? I mean, something that's really exciting. Any new developments or trends?
I haven't seen any that knock my socks off, but I'm used to cheeses like that. We did Oostalipa some time ago in the center. That was this Danish cheese that you cook up and make little cubes out of them. They used to dunk it and make coffee, things like that. So there's so many new products coming out that I wouldn't be afraid to try any of those.
Okay. Well, again, I appreciate the time that you've given us. It's been definitely a much different sort of podcast, focusing on food. Myself being from New Orleans originally, I'm a foodie. I love food. I'm a hedonist in that sense. So this did catch my interest, and I appreciate the fact that you were willing to, again, share your thoughts and observations. And also the book that you mentioned. So again, thank you, Miss Smukowski, for taking time out of your day to share this. And thanks to our audience for spending your time with us. And a shout out to all the cheesemongers and producers in the state of Wisconsin and also in all the other states here in the U.S. That are moving the cheese industry along. As your host, Maurice Brungart, I welcome you to join us again next week, that you invite others to follow us, where we provide a little extra perspective, because the devil's always in the details. Thank you again, ma'am.
You're welcome. Glad to help.